We are starting our tour of the kingdom's epic history, starting with origins, naturally, starting with the origins of all creation, and then the origins of God's people in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and into their formation as a people whom he will prepare, and through whom his kingdom will enter this creation. We won't be tracing the biblical story moment by moment. That would not be efficient. Instead, we'll look at how key biblical material contributes to the ethic of the kingdom of God. Genesis means beginning. It's the story of the kingdom's beginning, and it provides an origin narrative for Israel, as well as for the church which is grafted into Israel. And origin stories are immensely significant to human understanding and to human ethics. Our origins frame our self-understanding, and they frame the ethos of families, of nations, and of individual persons. In fact, a healthy origin narrative, a story of where one comes from that isn't tragic in character, seems essential to human emotional and social health. Whole nations and also individual people, as well as their families and clans, suffer terribly if they either lack an origin story or if their origin narrative is tragic in character, as is the case, for instance, in America for both indigenous Americans whose cultures were overrun by European settlement and the descendants of slaves who were brought here against their will and made second-class citizens at best, more like non-citizens. Those are tragic origin narratives. Well, the whole world has a tragic origin narrative, but Genesis wants to make clear that before that tragic narrative comes a good one. We are the products of God's purposeful and good creation. 3/4 of Genesis narrates the origins of Israel. That is what Genesis is really concerned about. But it sets those origins in the setting of God's making of the whole heavens and earth, as well as the whole human race. All of those acts of providence, acts of providing for the very creation that he's making, as well as loving providence for the triune God himself, as creation comes from the Father to the Son through the Holy Spirit and back. Well, the first moment of origin is obviously the creation of the stuff of creation itself. And that's described in Genesis 1 and 2 and elsewhere as God, in God's utter sovereignty, forges a world out of nothing and forges relationships for human beings, constitutive relationships that make us human, that make us the image of God, the imago Dei, by virtue of our unique relationships with God, with one another, with all the rest of creation, and with ourselves, with a degree of self-awareness. Genesis famously pronounces God's very favorable verdict on this work. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Creation expresses its own goodness, and that goodness is a gift from Israel's trustworthy God. A lot of Christians tend to see God's original work as perfect, and the word perfect means finished. And we are not in a position to say that Genesis 2, even the Garden of Eden, is finished. In fact, it sounds like it's unfinished. There was no one to till the soil, so God made human beings. God's plan for the garden is more than just a pristine original garden. It needs developing, and God uses human beings to do the developing, or at least he intends us to do that developing. So creation isn't perfect. It's not perfection, but it's a great start. It's a very good start. There are schools of ethics and theology that understand the so-called creation mandate, the order that God gave that human beings be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and work and till the soil, to serve as an adequate foundation for a vision of goodness and for an ethic. The creation mandate frames everything human beings are supposed to do. A creation mandate theology is popular in some evangelical circles, especially those in the Reformed or Calvinist tradition, but not exclusively those. It grounds an understanding of the significance of our work, our ordinary work, just like the gardening that should have been done by Adam and Eve in the story of the Garden of Eden. Another tradition that looks here for a warrant for its ethical vision is divine command theory, which focuses on law and on covenant. Now, the Bible is full of laws and covenants. They just don't stop in Genesis 1 and 2, of course. But they start here, don't they? Don't eat from the tree. Be fruitful and multiply. Following God's commands is a basis of flourishing, justice, and faith. And Eden represents the beginning, the mere beginning, of the disclosing of God's mysterious plan to unite all things in his Son. Some divine command theories like to emphasize what's new in these covenants. Dispensationalism likes to see each covenant in a sense superseding the earlier ones. And the big covenant, the new covenant in Jesus Christ, is to love one another. Whereas other traditions, in more or less the same theological neighborhood, want to emphasize the continuity of covenantal relationships, that all of God's commands come under the banner of a relationship that begins at the beginning. In that case, God's commands to the first human beings are an Adamic covenant, a covenant to Adam. God's creative act is not understood as a random act, not even a random act of kindness. Texts like Psalm 104, Proverbs 8, Hebrews 11:3, and especially John chapter 1, John's prologue, envision wisdom as creation's divine source. It is by wisdom that all things are made in Proverbs 8, and that wisdom is the word of John 1. Wisdom as creation's deep structure, and ultimately wisdom as creation's inhabitant. Creation is made as a kind of dwelling place for wisdom among her wise people. These terms, good, wise, are so important. They ground the hope and even the optimism about life that you find in the Abrahamic traditions, so-called Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that sensibility that this is a good world that comes from a good source stands in stark contrast to the precarious sensibility of Israel's neighboring societies, whose polytheism and animism saw the world as the kind of chaotic outcome of conflict among the gods. Israel's hope and optimism are manifested in everything from its family life to its attitude towards work, as well as Sabbath, rest, as well as its attitude towards tradition, study, and reflection, and even its perseverance in the face of suffering, because even if this is a good world, it's still a world marked by suffering. The assumption that the world is a good place, which manifests divine wisdom in some form, comes under some challenge in the era of the Enlightenment. It was behind the rise of science, and Newtonian mechanics saw the beauty of the universe expressed in the laws of nature. But some schools of Darwinian evolutionary theory don't see that kind of wisdom. They see the world as a more haphazard place. Well, that's a challenge to this vision of creation as good and wise and purposeful, but not an insurmountable one. The evolution of life can reflect the goodness and wisdom of God, at the same time that it also respects that this is just a beginning, that God's ultimate plan is not just more evolution, more survival of the fittest. God's plan is to bring a kingdom whose character is remarkably different than that. I mentioned wisdom's role in this, and I used a feminine pronoun because wisdom is personified in Israel's scriptures. And wisdom is more than personified in the New Testament. Wisdom is a person, the second person of the Trinity, the Word made flesh in John 1:14, the firstborn of all creation, over all creation in Colossians 1:15-20. Everything was made by him and in him and for him. And his work, Jesus' work, amounts to new creation, which is a startling image intentionally meant to evoke the original good and purposeful and wise creation. This new work of creation is on the old creation. Old creation is the object of new creation's work. I think it's worth a trip to Romans 8:18 to see the relationship between the old and new creation. My highlights point out the role of old creation language, those are in brown, the color of dead stuff, as well as the role of new creation language, that's in green, the color of life. 8:18, I, Paul, consider that the sufferings of this present age or time are not worth comparing with the glory that's to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons or heirs of God. For the creation was subjected to futility. The word futility there is the same as vanity in the Greek translation of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes' teacher says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Everything's pointless. Paul is echoing this when he describes creation as being subjected to that pointlessness. The creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but on account of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Another startling image, childbirth, meaning that from the old comes the new. And in this case, the creation is both the old, which is suffering, and the new, which is being born. Paul's image of creation itself as like a pregnant mother about to deliver demonstrates that creation's goal, and therefore its telos, its teleology, its goal is in some sense present in it. Its goal does not just transcend it. Theology likes to use a pair of words, transcendence and immanence, to describe how God is both far away, transcendent, and near, immanent, present in God's creation. Well, Paul is doing that, but he's doing that in a narrative way. He's not just giving you a static picture of a God who in some sense is close and in some other sense is far. He's giving his readers a picture of new creation suffering its oldness and waiting and longing and pushing for the revealing of its newness. And when its newness is revealed, what's hidden will become manifest, will become obvious to all. Its goal, its telos. Paul is obviously going somewhere in Romans 8. He's not just talking about pregnancy here, he's talking about what follows it. However, while we wait for that delivery, it's only natural to think about our present condition. And natural theology spends a lot of energy doing that, looking at ways that creation's goal or telos is already partially manifested and available in the current created order. It's here that natural theology finds room to discuss cardinal virtues, the so-called hinge virtues, that seem to be important in every human community. Natural theology associates these virtues with general revelation, qualities of God and God's goodness that are available and observable, because with careful thinking we can discern or discover those qualities. Paul is doing something like that in Romans 1 when he says the creation reveals the invisible nature of God. And because we can discover something of the moral quality of creation, we're in a position to spread it through human effort, through teaching and example. And that's what we see in the Queen of Sheba's devotion to Solomon's wisdom. She comes from far away to visit and learn. That is a picture of the human pilgrimage to the natural knowledge of the created world and some sense of its goal, its goodness. And the Queen of Sheba's pilgrimage to Solomon to learn about the natural world anticipates the way that the thriving Jewish intellectual tradition, not just focused on God's covenant, not just focused on Torah, but focused on God's world and confident of the goodness of God's world, has produced a rich intellectual heritage that leaves the world in debt to the Jewish tradition, which is grounded in not just special revelation of Torah, but the general revelation of God's goodness in the natural world, personified by Solomon. The Enlightenment focused extensively on what can be known about the natural world, and modern notions of universal natural rights, Kantian universal reason, and universal justice, a moral arc or a moral shape to the universe, also often appeal to creational wisdom rather than special revelation. So you can see just how much has been built on this creational framework for an ethic and for a vision of goodness. However, here we have to be careful, very careful, that in search of common ground across traditions, across human communities, we don't give away what comes next, because multiple surprises lie in store as the kingdom's saga unfolds, and creation's true and full end comes into view. The key stage in that big reveal comes in Jesus' incarnation, his ministry, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension to the right hand of the Father with the promise to return. All of that is what new creation refers to in a text like Galatians 6:15, where Paul says, circumcision doesn't count, uncircumcision doesn't count. New creation is what counts. That word new creation is shorthand for all that Christ has accomplished, apart from the rest of Israel's story in the Torah.